The Psychology of Deception, Episode 2, Pathological Lying. So how often do you lie? Not the big manipulative lies, the little ones, the little white lies, the polite lies, the ones meant to avoid hurting someone's feelings, like saying that hairstyle looks good on you, or put off a discussion you're not ready to have, such as, no, there's nothing bothering me, or to avoid receiving concern from others. No, I'm fine, there's no problem. Or just to get out of a situation. No, I'm busy this weekend, even when you're not busy this weekend. Almost everyone lies, as far as even the polite lies like that, unless you have a variety of neurodivergence, which can cause problems in social reading to know when you should politely socially lie, or people raised in neglectful or socially isolated environments who have never picked up social reading and can't do that. For the most part, everyone at least politely lies for other people's feelings or to hide some of our own feelings. These are very typical, and they're usually socially expected and mostly socially acceptable. In fact, there are times when telling the truth is considered rude, that it's considered polite to lie, that it's expected. Ricky Gervais did a movie called The Invention of Lying, in which in this world no one lied, and he became the first person who was capable of it. And a lot of people were what we would consider very socially rude in the things they said. Now, some people criticized the movie because the people in it seemed to have no impulse control when it came to saying whatever was on their minds at the time. But you could also argue that withholding information is its own form of deception. We deceive not just by giving people false information to influence their views, their opinions, their actions, but we also do it by withholding information that could influence them in a way that we don't want to influence them. So it's easy to see how that would fit in also to deception. But what about people who lie about almost everything, and even silly things that there's no need to lie about, and don't even seem to realize they're lying? People who are pathological liars, even lying about little things, or the big exaggerators. Pathological lying and exaggeration are actually closely related. Exaggeration, also known as embellishing or overstating, usually is meant to impress or emphasize a point when the actual info doesn't feel like it's going to create enough of an impression on the person receiving the information. The truth conveys information. Exaggeration is meant to add a reaction or elicit a positive response. Exaggeration maximizes the effect of the information, or at least it is meant to. The problem with exaggeration, when the person receiving the information doesn't know the information, they think the exaggeration is true, that it is the actual information. When they learn the exaggeration is not true, they can also doubt the truth when they do learn it. Exaggeration creates risk in getting people to believe you. Whereas when the receiver does know the actual information, or at least part of it, they can then understand how the exaggeration is for emphasis. For example, when we use global expressions in communication, such as in relationships, when you say, you never do X, whatever X is, when the person does sometimes do it, in those cases, we understand that the exaggeration is meant to communicate the magnitude of the emotion that's coming from behind it. Not that you really do that all the time, but that's how powerfully the person is feeling the behavior. When global exaggerations are used by us in relation to our own behavior and our own experiences, we refer to them as catastrophizing, such as, I never get a break. Nothing ever works for me. I will never get ahead. Things always go wrong. Things like that, even when those absolutes aren't really true. If such catastrophizing is repeated, it is self-reinforcing, and the person will actually start to accept it as true. The problem with that is it starts to limit or inhibit any behavior which could prove it wrong. If I don't believe anything ever works out for me, that I'm never going to succeed at something, I will stop trying to succeed at that. I will stop trying to push through. I will self-limit myself because I believe in limitations I don't actually have. But by not trying, I don't run the risk of failing, right? We also know of this as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what about pathological liars? When we're talking about pathological liars, we're talking about the people who lie spontaneously, apparently without even self-awareness that they're lying. And why? How can that be? How can you not be aware that something you're saying isn't true? It's because their answers are based more on what feels good to respond rather than what is accurate. Pathological liars usually come from abusive or dysfunctional upbringings or prolonged abusive dysfunctional relationships. But we need to note here, pathological lying, although it can be trained early in childhood from being in a dysfunctional environment, it can form any time in the lifespan. If you go through a prolonged period of an abusive or dysfunctional relationship, it's not something that has to be set in childhood, even though it quite often is. The key is it forms as a defense mechanism when telling the truth is risky, when it could bring punishment. Now you may ask, well, why would you risk that? Isn't lying itself inviting greater punishment if it's discovered? Yes, but lying creates a chance to avoid the punishment. Lying becomes functional in a dysfunctional environment. It is a survival mechanism. Therefore, it gets reinforced and it becomes automatic. So it continues even after the individual has escaped the dysfunctional environment, where it's no longer necessary. It becomes a trained response. How does it become an automatic reinforced response? We get a dopamine hit, a brief feel-good moment, when we come up with a right answer. We become conditioned to associate the right answer with the feel-good hit. If the truth is punishing, we seek an alternative which feels good. An answer that feels self-protective will feel good and will be the selected response. Eventually, we'll automatically select the feel-good answer, even if it's not the truth. And again, we're not even thinking, it becomes automatic. Think about back in school when you took a multiple choice test, and let's say you studied very well for this test, and you read a question, you look down those 4 or 5 answers, and your brain spots the one that is the correct answer. You get a dopamine hit when you see that because you know it's the correct answer. That answer is the feel-good response. So you get trained to associate the correct answer with the feel-good answer. So that just becomes an automatic thing. When you're asked any question, your brain pulls up options and you will automatically go for the feel-good one. Usually, that's the correct one. But if the truth could bring harm or stress or anything else, your brain may automatically go for an alternative that isn't true, but is the feel-good answer. And because it's an automatic response, there is no deep processing or assessing of the answer to determine or to verify that it's the true response. The feel-good response is the one that avoids a negative response, negative emotion or punishment. And here's where we go right back to Skinner and operant conditioning. There's sometimes confusion on when we talk about reinforcement on what positive and negative reinforcement are. People sometimes think negative reinforcement means punishment. It actually doesn't. It's also a reward. Now, how does that work? Positive reinforcement is when you get a reward, something that feels good for doing a certain thing, and that motivates you to do that same thing again. Negative reinforcement is when you take away something bad that also makes you feel good. This is why painkillers can be so powerfully addicting, not just biologically, but psychologically, because they are positive reinforcers because you get this happy little buzz off the painkiller quite often. But they're also negatively reinforcing because they take away the pain. In the case of pathological lying, choosing the feel-good response, even if it's not true, feels like it removes the threat of pain or stress. And so it is negatively reinforcing. That's what makes it so powerful. Can pathological liars be made aware that they're lying? This is a tricky one. There's some catch-22s in here, because when a pathological liar is called out on their lie, they can rationally realize they did not tell the truth. The problem is the calling out creates a negative emotion. It creates a sense of threat. This can actually produce automatically further impulsively driven false responses as a self-defense response. In extremes, it can result in emotional or behavioral outbursts at the person who drew attention to the lie. So keep in mind, this is different from someone who's consciously lying with the intent to deceive. The pathological liar is lying as a survival response. The brain has confused lying as necessary for survival, and it's become automatic. Can a pathological liar be reformed? Yes, but the key is a supportive environment where telling the truth is not perceived as a threat. Reinforcement is always better at molding behavior than punishment, because a threat with punishment is too often the punishment can become associated with the punisher more than it becomes associated with the behavior. We hear people from my generation especially talking about how we were spanked growing up and we knew right from wrong. Spanking didn't teach us right from wrong. It taught us how to hide our behavior from the punisher. And quite often it taught us to be afraid of the punisher. I hear people from my generation talking about being spanked growing up, and I'll ask them, yeah, how often did you get a whooping? And they'll mention moments from childhood up into their teen years. And I tell them, well, if the spanking was such a great tool to teach you right from wrong, why did you keep doing this stuff? Why did you keep needing to be punished? And I can tell you, as someone who was a teenager in the 70s, when spanking was common, spanking wasn't a big threat when it came to Friday, Saturday night behavior when you were away from your primary punisher. It just made you better at hiding the behavior from the punisher. Reinforcement reward is always better at motivating behavior. And I know this sounds kind of dark, but humans are driven more by pleasurable responses than by painful responses when it comes to molding behavior in the direction you want them to go. It's really, when we talk about a supportive environment, the same as helping any person who developed dysfunctional traits from abusive or dysfunctional environments. Be aware of when the dysfunctional traits are triggered and guide them to a functional alternative rather than the dysfunctional one. Reinforcing honest behavior is always better than punishing lying behavior, because the threat of punishing actually feeds the behavior. It's what started the behavior to begin with. If you have a natural gas fire going on, you're not going to choose gasoline to try to put it out. That's why, again, reinforcement is always better than punishment. They need to understand that the behavior is not part of their personality. It doesn't mean they're a bad person, that it was a product of the environment they were in, and it was a survival response. It was natural and expected. But the current environment no longer requires it. For example, a simple lie like lying about putting an empty juice container back in the refrigerator. Point out that's not a big deal. I'd simply prefer that you put it in the sink or in the garbage or somewhere else so I know we need to get juice. It's not some big thing that makes me think negatively about you. Because these are automatic responses, it can take time to reprogram the new behaviors, especially if they were built in as survival responses. And it can be especially problematic because you need to actually cue up and bring up the behavior to challenge it. I was in a relationship for a little more than 5 years with someone who had had kind of a rough upbringing, very kind of judgmental, abusive father, and I wasn't looking for any behaviors out of that because she had been removed several years from that environment. But as a personal example here, there was a day when she asked me to take her to the espresso stand to get her a drink. And I said, yeah, let's go. It was a Sunday, and we hopped in the car to head over there. And just out of my driveway on the corner from my house, the serpentine belt broke in my car. And if you know which one that is, it controls a lot of functions in the car, such as power steering, water pump, things like that. You really shouldn't be driving the car when that's not functioning. Now, because I was so close to home, I was able to work my way back into the driveway. It's a rough go when you don't have working power steering, but I was able to get back there. It wasn't until we were parked back in the driveway and I had the car shut off that I noticed she had gone completely silent, her eyes downcast, sitting in the passenger seat, as if she was about to be punished for something. And it didn't strike me until that moment that her dad was the type that would have got angry at her for what just happened because we were taking her to get coffee. Therefore, the car breaking down was somehow her fault that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been going to get her something. That threat didn't exist in the environment we had. I even pointed out to her, it is good it broke here on our way to get you coffee, because if it hadn't, it was going to break the next time I drove the car. And the next time I was going to drive the car was the next day, Monday morning, going to work. And that would have been much worse than having it break on a Sunday where I could get it back home. I had plenty of time to go buy another belt and put it on. It was a good thing that it broke down that day. It had nothing to do with you. It had to do with the mechanics of the car. I had not realized until that moment that she still had defensive, self-protective responses from that upbringing. And I tried to start paying attention to the possibility of more of them that weren't functional in our environment that we had. So it does take time and it takes patience because it is a trained, conditioned response. It won't go away after one time. You have to keep eating away at it until the brain itself starts basically dissolving away the neural pathways, the synaptic connections that reinforce it, and start building through synaptogenesis the new pathways that fit into your current environment. That's true with anything. Any environment you're in, whether it's functional or dysfunctional, you develop traits that are functional within that environment. And when you move to a new environment, sometimes some of those traits don't fit into the new environment, and it takes time to alter them. And again, those traits have to be triggered, have to emerge before they can be challenged. Pathological liars aren't the brand who are intentionally manipulative. They are the kind who are defensively manipulative. And again, it usually comes from upbringing more than, they're not necessarily narcissistic or manipulative. Again, it is a survival response. That was a relatively short run through of pathological lying, but it was something I've received a lot of questions about, and it does fit as a pretty good foundation piece for some later segments we may do in this series on deception.